Welcome to lecture number 1 of Program and Service Planning, Module 422. For some of you, this will be review, but it's still well worth watching again. It's been a while since we've talked about some of this material, and there is certainly a reason for you to get to the end of the video because slide 7 includes an exercise and instructions on how to answer. So this module is all about planning. Why do we plan? Well, first of all, we have to remember that we have an ethic called accountability. And you should recall that accountability is essentially the addition of being responsible and being open, those two things together. So we demonstrate the ingredients we put into our work along the way. For example, we keep our receipts and timesheets to show how much money is being spent, how many hours are being done. We keep track of mistakes and accidents with things like incident reports. But we also track how close we get to the expected outcomes, and those are called goals, and we'll be spending quite a bit of time talking about how we set goals in this module. We also want to make sure that we are consistent, and you'll remember that consistency is defined as working the same from person to person, place to place, and time to time. For example, if you have two places, a group home or a day program, and they're doing very different things to try and support an individual, you can imagine how frustrating and confusing that might be for that supported individual, and that usually also means that the efficacy and feelings of comfort by coworkers or colleagues is also undermined, and that can lead to frustration there. Similarly, two different shifts in the same facility might need to make sure they're doing the same thing, or two different coworkers. So we make sure that we write things down and that we have a collaborative approach so that people are more likely to work in the same way. And purity is the third thing. Purity just simply means that we do things the right way, that we do them the way that they were designed to be done. Imagine that a person is trying to bake and they keep substituting ingredients. At the end of that, they're going to have something that is quite different than what they first set out to do. When it comes to behavioral procedures, medical procedures, psychosocial interventions, there are some best practices that we want to make sure we follow. And if we don't follow them, if we don't do them the way that research and evidence suggests they should be done, if we are impure, then we won't get very good results. Response to intervention just simply means assess and address. That's the second thing on our list, that we start something at usually a fairly minimal level of intrusion and intervention. And if it's not working, then we add more or change our interventions. So having a plan allows us to sort of escalate or adjust as we need to. And that is often known by this fairly cryptic term, response to intervention, or you'll hear people talk about RTI. All they really mean is starting with the simple and assessing to see whether it's working, and then knowing what you would add in at level 2 or level 3. And that's done in schools as well as in community programs. Planning also makes sure that we are collaborative, so it gives the self-advocate, the supported person who is developing the ability to speak for themselves or who already has that ability, a chance to actively participate. And same with other stakeholders, including their family, their friends, even people that you might not think of off the cuff. For example, non-professionals such as their church minister or their sponsor in a 12-step program, their landlord or their employer. And sometimes the relatives aren't necessarily the people you might expect. It's not always parents. It might be siblings. It might be their children. And so these are really critical because those people not only often have information that the professionals don't have, but they're often the people who are the longest serving and will be there after us as well. They're kind of the glue in the whole thing. So it's not just a nice thing to do, it's a critical thing to do, because if we don't have the input of those collaborators, especially the person being served, then anything we do is not likely to be successful. And that leads to the next thing. We really need to have consensus. We need to have agreement around that table and to work in an aligned way. If we're pulling in separate directions, we're simply not very likely to get very far. Planning allows us to take a psychosocial rehabilitation approach, PSR. Sometimes you'll remember it's BPSR, which means biopsychosocial rehabilitation. And we'll explore that again in a moment. But basically it means looking at the whole person and giving them an active role in planning for themselves. When we plan, we can take a more accurate snapshot or inventory of the gaps and needs that a person has in their life, as well as looking at the resources and strengths they have in their life. Too often in our field, people have been guilty of thinking that they have to get something from a professional or that it has to cost money. And in fact, often family members or neighborhood groups or other community assets can play a big role in filling people's needs. And we'll give some examples of that as we go through this module, but it's not always necessary to think about something being developed within your own agency or within your own specific program. Something as simple as a church or a Boy Scout group or a local sports team or even the library might be incredible resources for somebody. Planning allows us to take a long-term view. In the past, people have thought about what was going to happen with an individual while they were in their facility, but they didn't think about what would happen as people graduated or moved on. Imagine a person who's in a 30-day homeless shelter, and the idea is to transition that person to something called a second stage facility or back into their own community home. If we don't have a long-term view, an amazing number of people are lost in that transition. At the end of 30 days, we have been guilty of thinking about it as a graduation or as a success. But often people feel abandoned and isolated, and they slip right back into the old circumstances. So we don't want to do that. We want to think about short-term goals that lead or are part of a longer-term set of goals. We want to be coordinated and strategic and think about how specific programs fit into service plans. And what we mean by program plans and service plans is something we'll explore in more detail later on. But program plans can best be described as the set of steps that we're going to take. And service plans can best be described as the resources or overall approaches that we're going to take. Program plans are more specific and service plans are more general. For example, if you have a child that's going to swimming lessons is a service, but the specific plan that the swimming instructor intends to teach at your child's level would be an example of a program plan. It's also important when we're planning to think about three important ingredients: the reactive, the proactive, and the preventative. And all three of these things are important. People often diminish the idea of reactivity. We hear it used as a negative. Oh, you're too reactive. Well, if we're only being reactive, then that's a valid concern. But we definitely want to have some reactive planning. So let's start from the start. Preventative planning means that we're doing what we can to reduce the likelihood of risk, to make sure that at the beginning of things, a problem is less likely to occur. But we need to be careful when it comes to preventive planning, because we don't want to keep people from having any kind of adversity in their lives at all. Imagine if your muscles never needed to lift any weight. They would become completely atrophied, the way that astronauts who are weightless come back to Earth. And when they come back into Earth's gravity, they can't walk anymore and they're at risk. And we don't want to do that with people physically, psychologically, emotionally. We want people to experience life, but by the same time, we want to take reasonable precautions. So for example, an example of a preventive strategy might be something you would see in a recovery home, where we would check people who were coming in as part of the intake process to make sure that they didn't have any drugs or other contraband on them. It would just be an unnecessary risk to bring drugs into the facility. Proactive strategies are the next set of strategies. And these are strategies that are specifically trying to create progress in the long term. They are trying to take help a person achieve a desired behavior or set of desired behaviors in the long term. For example, in your life, going to school is a proactive strategy. You're trying to change something in your life, improve your ability to make an income or to have a job that you enjoy. And so you're doing a host of things that will help you to do that. Reactive strategies are strategies we use when problems arise, or especially when we see the troublesome behavior. Even though being sick isn't a troublesome behavior, we have a reactive strategy in our class of what to do if you are sick. Calling in, getting notes from other people, meeting with me when you return, and getting an adjusted schedule are all examples of reactive strategies. So we need to have a combination of those things, and sitting down and planning in a concerted and deliberate way allows us to do that. Next, we said I would go back and talk about the PSR approach. So here's a summary of that. And you'll recall that it really works well to think about the medicine wheel from First Nations or Indigenous traditions. The PSR approach, or biopsychosocial approach, means that the supported person is empowered to have a central role in their wellness. If you think about it, that only makes sense if we do things that other people don't want to do. If we ask them to do those things, we'll get nowhere. Now, sometimes, of course, people start off being inadequately equipped to do much for themselves. And so it may be a limited role for a person in the beginning, but we want to constantly be asking ourselves how to give a person an evolved and increasing role. And we have to limit ourselves in terms of how much we want to control things, because people will often go in ways that work for them, that are functional for them, but very different than the way we would personally want to work. So we're going to be least intrusive and least restrictive, letting people make choices that are seemingly functional for them, and to teach them how to self-assess. We also want to include external assets in their lives, the allies and assets that help them, not just professionals, because of course, remember that just like a student graduating from school, when we're successful, we tend to move away from those professionals, and those professionals start helping somebody else. So in our lives, we need to have other resource people. And again, they could be friends, they could be family, they could be teammates, they could be people in a club, they could be our neighbors, our landlords, our roommates, our employers, and just people we see routinely in the community. And I've seen some very creative things. So I want you to be creative as you think about these allies and assets as you're doing your Scott case. And you can be quite imaginative and creating your particular interpretation of the case. And imagine some of the folks he might have in his circle. The idea of PSR is to be comprehensive, meaning that we think about all of these things at one time instead of in a serial format. Serial means in a series, so boom, 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 working along a line. We don't want to think about each of these as a step towards the other, because there is no clear place that we start. We don't emotionally start and then feel, okay, well, the person's emotionally well now, so let's move to the physical. And that's been a criticism in our field for a long time, where, for example, people have focused on making folks stable physically, for example, with medication. And then when that happens, they would try to, for example, house them. And then from there, they might help them to reconnect with their family or get a job. Well, really, those things need to happen, if not all at once, they need to happen in a deliberate and strategic way. So almost like the way a musician writes a symphony, when each instrument comes in is part of what makes that piece of music interesting. And so we want to think about that. And again, these allies can be part of this. We have to think about balance. If a person is really weak in the physical, it doesn't matter if they're really strong in these areas, or if they're really strong mentally, but they're not really well in these areas, things will fall apart. So we're trying to look at where a person needs the most sort of support. A really great metaphor is to think of these as the legs on a four-legged stool. And if one of the legs is shorter, then the stool will constantly tip over. So we want to make sure that whatever areas are most lacking are the ones we prioritize. We've talked about this term before, habilitation, which simply means working with the person in the longer term, rather than thinking of finding a cure or leaving them after some point and saying, you're well now. Habilitation looks at adjusting to a person over the long term. It includes teaching, housing, adaptations. It includes physical supports, includes medical supports. And it's very similar to sorts of things that your parents did with you as you were raised. When you were a little kid, you needed a lot more. And as you got older, you needed less and less and less. And hopefully, if you need something again, your family is still there to come in more when necessary. So we think about this approach more than just simply trying to treat people, although there may be aspects, for example, in the physical, of things that do need treatment, like, for example, addiction or diabetes, where we are helping that person overall. So treatment can be a part of habilitation. RTI, we've already talked about. RTI is a sub-idea of PSR, response to intervention. We assess a person, try something, and reassess to see if it's working, adding, adjusting, or even sometimes decreasing supports based on what's going on. And the whole idea behind this is that if we help a person to have a better overall quality of life, we'll help a person to be more self-sufficient or self-reliant and to continue to be well into the future, as opposed to trying to find one magic solution that solves other problems. Instead of giving a person a pill and expecting everything's going to be better, we recognize that usually people have more complex problems, and if we can address those ingredients, things like trauma or housing instability, then we are more likely to help the person with their behavior and their mental health and other things that might be erupting in their lives. We want to make sure we use best practices, which includes that we always assess the person as a first step. And that means we're looking at the functional assessment. In other words, trying to understand the needs behind the things that they're doing. Why are they doing what they're doing? And for those of you who are newer to the class, you'll be working with partners who have more experience in this. But the idea when we're doing a functional assessment is to understand the learning needs of a person. Perhaps they simply haven't developed a skill. Perhaps they don't have a physical ability. Maybe there's a medical problem, or maybe there's a motivational problem. Perhaps the person is lacking self-esteem or needs attention or needs power in their life. So we want to understand the function behind a person's behavior, and we want a baseline. A baseline is just simply a pre-photo. You can imagine weight loss advertising where they do a before and after photograph. A baseline is a before shot. What was the person's weight? What was the person able to lift? What was their measurements? These are all ways that we could simply do a baseline. So imagine we're working with somebody who was using heroin, and they said something like, well, they were using heroin 4 times every 2 days or every day and a half as part of their pre-recovery baseline. And later on we said, well, this person has used heroin only once in the last 6 months. We would still see that as progress even though the person had a relapse. And that's because we can compare the numbers. We're also going to continuously assess during our interventions to see what's working. And this could include assessment that is qualitative, meaning we're looking at the quality of things. For example, if I'm working with somebody, again, in recovery, I might ask them how they're feeling. I might ask them what's working for them, how they're getting along with their therapists and their colleagues in group, and finding out what isn't working for them so that I can address it. I might also want to check to see what was done previously. And if it didn't work, I might want to not do it. And if it did work, I might want to do it again. Or if it didn't work, I might want to understand why and adjust it. We've already talked about the idea that we need to use both proactive and reactive approaches, and you can add preventive. That is a best practice in and of itself. You can't just use one or the other. And you'll often have people ask you just to come in and do planning in a reactive way. For example, it's very common for people to call me up and say, I'm working with a student who acts out aggressively. Could you come in and do a crisis intervention plan for that person? And they're always taken aback when I say, well, I can't just do a crisis intervention plan. That's not ethical. We also need to think about how we might proactively address whatever needs there are behind his aggressive behavior and see if we can gradually improve it. Otherwise, we can guarantee you that you'll simply need to use that crisis intervention plan more and more and more, or it will become less effective. So if you don't do both of these things and also some prevention, you're just going to be far less likely to be successful. The third one is we always set a goal and we always include an end date in that goal. And people are often surprised that we start by setting a goal. And we'll speak much more about that in a later lecture. We always develop strategies with a team instead of just doing it to the team. And again, people are somewhat surprised if they call me as a behavioral consultant. They say, can you develop a program for? And one of the very first things that I'll do is I'll say, well, let's have a meeting with everybody in that group, including the supported individual, if that's possible. And they sort of look at you with glazed eyes and wonder why you aren't just solving the problem. And the answer to that question is that if I do something and just prescribe it, it's far less likely to work. I would be guessing at what would work, and I might be missing very much what other people feel comfortable doing. I simply cannot do it without having the input of others. And people become nervous because they think, I'm not a behavioral expert. But they don't need to be a behavioral expert. That's what we are there to do, to be a facilitator. And we're simply looking for input from people around what they think might work from a range of options, and thinking about feasibility things like how much time do people have, for example. We want to make sure everybody understands as we go through this process. We don't just, again, prescribe. We want people to understand the reasoning behind, the rationale for those program procedures. And the reason is that if we don't, people don't follow them, or they contort them very significantly. Years and years ago, I was working with an individual who could become quite insistent and provocative when he got upset. He would tap on people's shoulders, he would yell, he would slap himself, he would run around. He got really, really loud. And as part, a very small part of his program, we had a reactive strategy based on the idea of extinction. We wanted him to not use that behavior, so we wanted to make sure it wasn't effective for him. So the moment that he started yelling and screaming and tapping, somebody would exclaim to everybody else in the facility, "Oh, John is on John off the table right now," and meaning we're not talking to John while he's acting this way. It's a very, very concise terminology so that it didn't give him a lot of extra attention. And when that happened, people would just sort of walk away and make themselves scarce and not interact with him. And he would very, very quickly calm down when he could see that this wasn't happening, and he would immediately change the tone of his voice and immediately change the way he was interacting, at which point we would very quickly respond to him and give him an educational correction and tell him, next time do that right away and you'll get our attention faster. And that was a very effective technique, but it was only part of a larger suite of things. For example, he had a schedule that he could use to help plan his day. He would have check-ins throughout the day to tell us his feelings. He had a range of activities that included activities that would help him to get his physical energy expressed. He was set up with some of his favorite people in those activities so that he was getting his social needs met. He was learning a bunch of skills, including communication skills and coping skills. His medicines were adjusted, his diet was adjusted, his sleep was adjusted. All of those things were happening. And we worked with his group home to make sure that they used a similar program. When the group home got a new supervisor who was not very versed in any of this stuff, she latched on to the specific reactive strategy I talked about earlier, the off the table. She decided that was going to be the part of the program that she wanted her staff to use, and she didn't bother to train or evaluate or monitor any other part of it. And in fact, she renamed it. She called it his drama program. And ultimately, she had huge issues where even though he was making progress with those of us at the day program, his behavior got quite erratic at the group home. And in fact, for the first time ever, became aggressive because nobody knew how to help him meet his needs. People only knew how to ignore him when he was behaving in a way they didn't like. And so he started to escalate and grab people and became physically aggressive. Luckily, that lady ultimately lost her job. She was simply not able to understand. I'm not happy that she lost her job, but I am happy that something happened that allowed us to grasp that, work with that team and have that team address the problem again. The whole idea is that if your coworkers don't understand why they're doing things and they think that they can do them in part or they can pick and choose strategies, things are going to get worse. So it's important that everybody be involved. And one of the curious things, even for this individual who had very limited verbal capacity, is that he understood the difference between the way the two programs were dealing with him. Even though he did not have a high IQ, we explained the program to him. It needed to happen fairly often, but he really understood how it worked, and that's why it worked. So it's really important that you keep everybody informed and make sure they understand. And again, the idea of comprehensiveness, that PSR idea, is also a best practice. Ethics. One of the most important things we need to understand is that we need to be client-centered. That means that we have to be able to address the person's needs for power. And it's really easy for staff people to start to take on a correctional officer's attitude that somehow they're the people in power and that the people that they're supporting have less power. We want to have the exact opposite attitude. We're there to help empower people, remember that. And the choices that they make, we have to respect, even if they're different from our own choices. If you take away power and attention from a person, I guarantee you they will start to behave in a way that is challenging for everybody else. So being focused on what the client needs, giving them opportunities to meet their social needs, to have power, to have lots of attention, to get attention in ways that are constructive and socially desired, to really matter to people, that makes a huge difference. We also want to make sure that we're not using punitive or punishing approaches or aversive approaches. So let's review what punitive means. A punitive approach is an approach that uses punishment, and a punishment is an arbitrary consequence put in place by a person in power to someone with less power. I'll say it again. A punitive approach is a punishing approach. Punishment is defined as a person with more power applying an arbitrary consequence to somebody with less power. So it's not that people can't have consequences, it's that they can't have arbitrary consequences that only stick because of power. Let me give you a couple of examples. I decide I'm going to go skateboarding in the rain. And I take my skateboard out, the wheels get full of water, and I take it home and I leave it in my backpack, which is plastic inside. I wouldn't be surprised if my wheels seize shut. This is exactly what happened to my son, and that is an example of a consequence called a natural consequence. Nature did it. No other person needed to do it, and it happened as of its own accord. Now, typically, natural consequences are ethical. Not always, but typically. And I'll give you an example of one that is unethical. If a person has decided they're going to go skateboarding in the middle of the highway, that might not be something where we want the natural consequence to take effect, because clearly the natural consequence could be deadly. Sometimes natural consequences may be ethical, but they're not very reliable. So for example, you hear people say about their children, well, let them eat all of their candy. They'll get sick and they won't want to eat all of their candy at once next time. Except that many children can eat candy sort of ad infinitum and never get sick. So it's not a very predictable consequence sometimes. So if it's not too extreme and it is predictable, then a natural consequence might be acceptable. Logical consequences are also usually acceptable. A logical consequence is put in place by another person, but it's not arbitrary. Arbitrary means random or not connected. And logical consequences are connected. They're connected by reason or logic. So for example, if a child goes out in the backyard, starts throwing baseballs around and breaks the window, an example of a logical consequence would be that they might have to pay for the repaired window. But there are more than one possibility. For example, you might say that the logical consequence is that they have to clean up the glass, or that they're not allowed to play with the baseball in the backyard anymore, or even that their baseball is taken away from them. However, any of those can be connected by logic. One of the most common problems people have is that they assume that logical consequences are not as severe as punishments, and that simply isn't true. Let me give you an example. If I decide tomorrow that I'm going to pour paint into the stream near my house, the fine I'll receive would likely cause me to have to sell my home. But I don't have enough information yet to tell you whether or not that is a punishment or a logical consequence. If somebody told me that the amount of my fine was equal to the amount that the government needs to pay to clean up the stream and replenish the fish stocks, that would be a logical consequence. Even if it cost, let's say, $500,000 to do that. On the other hand, if the government told me, you have to pay a $10,000 fine, and I asked them why, and they said, because that's what it says here in this book, that's arbitrary. Even though it's a lesser consequence than the $500,000 version or $500,000 version, it would be a punishment. So don't assume that logical consequences or natural consequences are not as severe as punishments. Nothing to do with severity in the description of these three types of consequences. So, another common mistake that people make is the idea that something is accepted in our society and therefore it must not be a punishment. Let me give you an example. Two children misbehave in school. One of them yells at their teacher. They're told that they have detention after school. So they go into another room and they sit there for a half an hour staring at the walls. That, even though it used to be a very common response to that exact type of scenario, is an example of a punishment. Looking at a wall for a half an hour at the end of the day has nothing whatsoever to do with what the person did. It may be common, but it's not logical or natural. And therefore it's a punishment, and therefore we wouldn't do it. However, if a child, let's say, got out of their seat repeatedly during a lesson and therefore didn't have their work done, and a teacher told them to stay after school to catch up on that work, and it happened to take them 27 minutes, that would be a logical consequence. Why? Because they were doing something that was directly a result of or connected to the problem behavior. Even though it was similar in the amount of time, it was not a punishment. So don't get confused by the ideas of severity or social commonness when you're making these definitions. Punishments are often common in our society, and they're often less severe than a natural or logical consequence. We can use logical and natural consequences most of the time. However, look at the second part of this statement. We really aren't trying to create anything unpleasant for people as a way of teaching. It turns out the research is very, very convincing. We're far more likely to do something if it is rewarding or reinforcing for us. And the only time that we need to add in consequences is if we've tried positive approaches and they haven't worked. Let me say that again. The only time we usually add in consequences is if we've tried positive approaches, rewarding approaches, and they haven't worked on their own. Think about the way society works. Most of the way that you're raised is by trying to give you some kind of good response for being a pro-social person, a community-minded, contributing, hardworking person. But we have a small select number of people who go into correctional facilities because they don't quite respond to those things. Now, the correctional facilities have a lot of room to improve, but the basic idea is that only a small number of people need somebody to point out the consequences to them to try and accelerate their behavior. And when we do that, as corrections facilities will tell you, it doesn't often work. So we really are focused on finding rewarding approaches, things that people will find work for them, instead of focusing on the aversive, on things that are unpleasant for folks. We want to try and make sure that we're looking at what's appropriate for a person based on their age, their gender, their overall lifestyle, and that is dignified, meaning it addresses the need for the person's social, emotional, and spiritual wellness. Dignity, you remember, is all of the non-physical parts of wellness. So safety is the physical part of wellness. If I am in a house that is physically safe, for example, poisons are locked away and tripping hazards are avoided. But if I'm in a home that is addressing my social, emotional, and spiritual wellness, it might be filled with the people I love. It might be filled with the things I love, like my books and my plants and my pets. It might give me opportunities to have meditation, spiritual activity, or to be connected to people who help me with those things. So dignity is really more than just respect. It's about helping a person to be well in all those areas, social, emotional, and spiritual. One of our ethics is, again, that we use tools that are based on assessment, meaning we don't do the same thing for everybody. We individualize. What they need comes out of their assessment, and we use strategies that are based on evidence. We don't just randomly suggest ideas. So there's lots and lots of evidence-based strategies out there, and we'll talk about some of those. And we keep records so that we have accountability, and we make sure those records are accurate as we go through this whole thing. I've already talked about the idea of least intrusion and least restriction. Intrusion means we intrude in people's lives as little as possible. Don't get involved in people's lives where they don't need you. If you go to work and you ask your coworkers to help train you in a set of skills at the workplace, and they start giving you advice for how to be with your boyfriend or your parents or how to raise your children, chances are you would feel quite offended. And we have to make sure that we're not going beyond the boundaries as well. Similarly, controlling people or restricting people unnecessarily isn't allowed. And we also need to know our limits. We are not experts, and that means we don't necessarily understand everything in the professional realm. For example, doctors and psychologists and behavioral consultants, therapists may be very valuable to us. But also we want to make sure that we think of other types of experts. The person is an expert in himself. A person's parents will know their history better than anybody else. Their kids or their friends may be experts in that person in some ways. There's an unnecessary comma here. One of the most important things we learned in an earlier module is that when something might have a medical explanation, we want to have one of the very first assessments we do, be a medical assessment. Get a doctor or other medical professionals to help us with that assessment. If something has a medical cause, it doesn't mean we can't also use psychosocial approaches, but it means we want to include the medical for sure. For example, let's talk about a person whose moods seem incredibly erratic. Well, hopefully we're starting to recognize that that might be evidence of diabetes. And so if a person has diabetes and you go out and you give that person exercise and dietary management and give them lots of social connections, but you didn't deal with the medical side of things, for example, by giving them medications or insulin or controlling their sugar intake, then you would be fighting against the most dominant factor for that person. Instead, we'd want to address that medical problem at a medical level with meds and sugar intake, but also have those psychosocial interventions, helping people to get exercise, monitor their sleep, have self-care routines, and so forth. So that's a classic example of how we would rule out medical first. I said I would talk earlier about the idea of the program plan and the service plan. And a great metaphor is that a service plan is essentially like an umbrella. And a program plan is much more like a drill. It gets into the very specifics of what we're going to do. So I'm going to start over here. Service plans describe the range of services that the person will be given, but they don't get into the detail about the specific steps. They don't need to. Service planning includes all kinds of people, including lay people, and so we don't need to get into specific technological planning with those people and overwhelm them. We want their input, and sometimes their input leads us to go off and do some specific sort of technical planning, and that is a program plan. So the idea is to create something, in this case, that anybody will understand, at least in a broad way, and it can include any of these, or all of these areas actually, not any. We'll look at the medical side of the person, but what their learning needs are, not just education in terms of reading and writing and arithmetic, but it might be life skills, or it might be social and coping skills, communication skills, self-care skills, the behavioral needs of the person. How can we help them to be motivated? How can we help them to feel rewarded for using pro-social behavior? How can we help them to overcome fears, just as an example? Social and recreational activities. What kinds of things does a person need in their life to have a more rich quality of life? For example, maybe they need to get outdoors more often, have a pet, have exercise, be connected to people who have similar needs to them, go and do things that are spiritually enriching. Their environment, and this could be something as simple as looking at the way their house is set up. Moments they need, for example, privacy or structure or understand how their environment works. And they might need to have their lifestyle and schedule adjusted. For example, maybe a person is too busy. Maybe a person is too bored. Maybe a person is a morning person versus a night person. So we'll explore all of that in more detail. And that is really the focus point of this particular module. And the program plan on the other side is an example of a service we might use. In other words, one service might be that we create a program for a person. Program plans get very specific about what to do when supporting a client. They are the recipe cards or the procedures that describe specific interventions. They're written in steps, just like a recipe or just like the rules of a game. And they describe the procedures that a professional will use. And I've highlighted the professional specifically because it's really not meant for family members or the individual themselves to go off and do this technical side of things. That would be too much. They exist in many domains, and particularly these three. For example, a medical program might include the plan employed by a physiotherapist. And it might include a small set of things that you're asked to do when you take that person home between physios, such as doing exercises or stretches. But the actual physio will have a set of plans. An education or training plan, a specific training plan such as what you did around life skills in the fall for those of you who are here, or like the teaching and lesson plan you did as role-playing teachers before back in February. And behavioral plans, plans that give people rewards for using new types of behavior, and reinforcement like that is an example of a behavioral plan. So we're focused on this one in this module. And one of the things that might come out of this type of planning is that we create or go to somebody who can create a specific program plan. So here's where I want you now to do a little bit of work. And I want you to go online after you sit down and think of a few ideas. And by all means, if you want to work with people by FaceTiming or developing a Google document, that's great. I want you to think about some of the interventions that we might put together for a person in these domains. So I will give you some examples and ideas in a subsequent video, but I want you to sit down and think about as many of these as you can. Now, when you get to the behavioral one, that is really going to be easier for people in our first semester, or the people who are now in second semester, I should say, than people who are newer to the class. But don't worry about that. Remember, in this module, we're not going to drill into that specific set of behavioral skills yet, and other people can help you with it as part of your group. So right now, I want you to think about the broad things that we might do here. Do your best, post them on Facebook, and we will talk about them later.